Yes, Josh, hi. Can you hear me?
Yep, now I can hear you.
So, Josh, thank you so much for taking time out of your very busy schedule to be able to talk to me. I know it has been very, very hectic. I am hoping that this will be a long-ranging conversation concerning your career in the State Department, your experience working in the Biden administration, along with the broader contours of the Israel-Palestinian conflict. And for the next hour, we're going to be getting into all of that. Um, so without further ado, let's get started.
Great.
So, Josh, b before we get into the actual meat of the Palestinian issue, the Israeli issue, and what we have been seeing in the past 2 years. Tell us a little bit about yourself. Like, how did you first get started into this space? And what motivated you to get into this space in the first place?
Yeah, thanks so much, Yassine. Good to join you. I worked in the State Department for over a decade in security assistance and arms transfers, but for a decade before that, I'd worked in various other roles in the U.S. national security sector, both in D.C. and overseas. And I suppose that broadly international relations has always been my interest, my passion, and I've been very lucky to have a career in that area. It's something that I went to college to study, came to DC for grad school, and one thing led to another. Um, and so, it's always been something that has fascinated me. And I think, more specifically when it comes to the Middle East in general and Israel and Palestine, I think in great part that's a function of the times that we have been living in and of my generation, of course, which was um, the post-Cold War generation, that period of America looking for a new role for itself, and I suppose also for, as they say, dragons abroad to kill, and the Middle East, unfortunately, becoming that dragon, and therefore the focus of attention. That certainly, I spent time in Iraq. I spent time in the West Bank working for the US and the UK governments. And so I was drawn more and more into these issues. And as you're drawn more and more into them, you can't help but see the nuances, the contours, the contradictions, and the humanity that is impacted by every decision that we make here in Washington, D.C. And so I think that's the path I've gone along.
So, for especially for those of us who are going to be watching this recording a little bit later, what year did you first get started in the State Department?
Um, so in the last role I had in the State Department, which was something called the Bureau of Political Military Affairs, which is security assistance and arms transfers and various other things we can talk about. I started there in 2012, but I'd worked for the State Department previously overseas and other roles for the US government for, a decade before that.
So, obviously, you are most well known for your decision in October of 2023 to resign from the State Department due to your opposition to the Biden administration's policy in Gaza. Now, you yourself have called that a moral decision because you do not want um, your conscience, if according to your own words, to be affected by that policy. Some would say, however, that why did you wait so long until that time? Because as according to your words, you were responsible for arms transfers in the State Department since 2012. And obviously the arc of US foreign policy since at least the post 9/11 era has been interference in the Middle East, whether it was our invasion of Iraq, whether it was our invasion of Afghanistan, whether it was the usage of drones. So why wait until Gaza? I mean, why did you not resign during the operation in Yemen? Why not resign when we were conducting drone warfare in all parts of the Middle East? Why wait until 2023 and why not beforehand?
Yeah, no, that's a very fair question. And actually, particularly when it comes to the case of the Saudi-led coalition in Yemen, I actually did have a resignation drafted and ready to go in my desk. but ended up not submitting it. And the reason I didn't was because up until that point, or through that point, I always felt that um, if you are going to have the opportunity within as big a bureaucracy, as big and complex a system as the US government and the US foreign policy and national security enterprise, uh, if you're going to have the opportunity to do good within that system, then or to have an impact within that system, you have to recognize that there are trade-offs. And that trade-off is having a bit of humility and recognizing that you are not going to turn the ship around, that this is a massive enterprise. It is about incremental change from within the system. But I felt that for as long as I was there, there was the opportunity to tilt that rudder in the right direction, to try and make things better, to introduce concerns about human rights, to have policy discussions both within the administration and with Congress that could bring about the possibility of change and in some cases, real change and to have an effect. For me, there were a couple of differences when it came to October of 2023 and Gaza. And those were, first of all, just the scale and the amount of damage and harm that was being done. By the time I left on October 18th of 2023, there were already 3,500 people who'd been killed in Gaza with US weapons, which was certainly unprecedented in my role in the State Department, my time in the State Department. But also it was that opportunity to make any difference went away, to mitigate any of this harm, which had been present even under the first Trump administration in the Saudi-led coalition in the Yemen context. There were still opportunities to slow things down, to raise questions, to shift policies. But what we had from the Biden administration was very clear direction that there will be no discussion, there will be no debate. You will do everything you can to move as quickly as you can on any weapons that Israel asks for. And so, I think you do in any of these jobs carry a lot on your conscience. But at the end of the day, when that trade-off is gone, when that ability to make any difference is gone, all you are left with is burden. And that is the point at which I think you have to leave.
So, talk about your experience within the Biden administration, because obviously, um, you were there since the very beginning. You were there when the first conflict in Gaza broke out in 2021. You were there during the Russian invasion of Ukraine. And you were there at the very beginning, after the Hamas attacks on October 7th. So tell us about your experience working in the Biden administration and how it differed and how it stayed the same compared to the Trump administration and the Obama administration.
Yeah, there's a lot to pick apart there. So I think the Biden administration um, came in with a significant amount of promise. Um, and an example of that actually is in the space I was working in, which was security assistance and arms transfers, where every president since Carter has had something called a conventional arms transfer policy. This is not law, but it's the guiding policy promulgated by the president that is supposed to shape decision making about who we give weapons to, when we give weapons, when we don't. And the Biden administration, to its credit, promulgated what was, what is to this date the most forward-leaning, the most proactive when it comes to human rights, conventional arms transfer policy, to the extent that for the very first time, it didn't just provide a framework, but it actually provided determinative language that said, if the risk of, violations of international law, of significant civilian harm is more likely than not, then arms shall not be transferred. And you know, and so in that context, I think we also saw in the Biden administration, on a number of policy areas, a significant amount of competence. You mentioned Ukraine. I think the lead up to that war and the preparation of America's allies and partners in Europe on how to respond and what was coming, I think was quite masterful. The problem was that at the end of the day, for all that pragmatism and all that, um, forward leaning on human rights, it all went out the window in the face of President Biden's ideological commitments to Israel, and I think the Democratic establishment's political decision making. And so, whatever good had been done, whatever competence had been displayed, whatever commitments had been made, um, it was all for nothing at the end of the day. And not only, I think, thrown out along with the legacy and the credibility of that administration, but also with significant and lasting harm done to America's legacy and credibility beyond the Biden administration and beyond the Israel-Palestine issue to the global context.
So you bring up a very what some would call very important point when you're talking about Biden's ideological commitment to Israel. As was said earlier, this was not the first time that the Israel-Palestine conflict had flared up. Before October 2023, Hamas and Israel had exchanged fire in May of 2021 in response to the decision by an Israeli court to evict Palestinian families from the Sheikh Jarrah neighborhood in East Jerusalem. What was it like in the State Department at that time?
Yeah, so that was first of all, obviously a much shorter conflict. It was also a less high intensity, but it was still one in which, if I recall correctly, about 2,000 people were killed in Gaza. The signature moment, I think, in that conflict, certainly from within the State Department, well, there were two. The first was there was a high-rise building in Gaza where a number of press outlets, including the Associated Press and American Press Enterprise were working out of that was struck by Israel. And the US government, the State Department, immediately demanded an explanation. And and ultimately, there wasn't one forthcoming, or that is to say that Israel provided allegations, but when it was demanded to provide us with evidence, there was never any compelling evidence to back up Israel's allegation that this was in any way a legitimate military target. And so that was one of the significant moments in that conflict that I think, is one of the factors that led the Biden administration to turn to Israel at that time and say essentially wind it in. The other was, and this is, I think, something that we've forgotten, that in the middle of that conflict, there was an attempt by the Biden administration notified Congress that it was moving forward with a major arms sale of air-to-ground munitions to Israel. And that was, I believe it was Senator Sanders who introduced a joint resolution disapproval to block that sale. That was the very first time that any such resolution had ever been introduced in the context of Israel. And I think that was a very clear shot across the bow that we now see a significant number of Democrats, in fact, a majority of Senate Democrats supporting that sort of resolution when it's been introduced most recently this summer of 2025. And I think that was a very important moment in had people been watching in seeing that the tide was turning and that certainly in some corners of American politics, the inviolability, the impunity was beginning to move away from Israel.
So, you were mentioning how that was a shot across the bow, right? And you mentioned how, during your time over there, uh, there at least at the very beginning, there did seem to be some efforts by the Biden administration at the very beginning to place some kind of constraints or apply some kind of pressure. Now, obviously, based on what we now know, 2 years after October 2023, there didn't really seem to be a lot of pressure. Now, you mentioned Biden's ideological commitment to Israel, but as you yourself know, Mr. Paul, the Biden administration was not just Biden himself. It was the people around him, whether it was his national security advisor, whether it was Antony Blinken, his Secretary of State, whether it was Lloyd Austin, whether it was Brett McGurk, Amos Hochstein. Like these people are usually called the architects of the Biden administration policy in Gaza after the Hamas terrorist attacks. Would you say that Biden had surrounded himself with a bunch of people who were not willing to give him any new information? Or do you think that they were the ones driving the policy and influencing Biden to act in a certain way?
Well, I think it's both. And actually, you had asked earlier about contrast between the Biden administration and the Obama administration. And this is one of those contrasts, right? Is that Obama famously surrounded himself with a cabinet of rivals, with a bunch of different opinions and different perspectives that then sort of could walk through issues and debate them. Whereas President Biden came into office essentially surrounding himself with the same set of close advisors that he had had for years, sometimes decades. And there were within that space, one of the things that made it effective, for better or for worse, is that when there was the direction given, everyone marched in the same direction. That's a contrast, for example, to the way the first Trump administration worked, where there were a few directions given, and where they were given, everyone marched in their own direction. In the Biden administration, because it was this closed circle, there was that sort of top-down ability to set the direction and path and move forward. But there were two problems with that. The first is that it was a closed circle that didn't really bring in any new perspectives, that was tied to its own visions, ideology, doctrines, and errors. And that secondly, once it then set off on a path, if that path was the wrong one, as it very clearly was very early on in the context of Israel's attacks on Gaza from October 2023 onwards, there was no ability to redirect it. It was a closed circle and remained so.
That is actually very interesting that you say that because based on what we have heard from other leaks happening in the State Department and from what you yourself have said, it seems that specifically in terms of Gaza, it was very much a top-down approach. Whereas from what we have seen, when it came to other geopolitical issues, there seemed to be a bottom-up approach regarding feedback and decision making. What is your stance on that theory?
Yeah, I think that's absolutely right, and not just. I mean, I'll give you a very vivid example of this. The way the arms transfer process itself typically works is a bottom-up process, by which I mean a country comes in and says we would like to procure, X US weapon, let's say a fighter jet, and that goes into essentially the junior levels of the State Department to review and look at, okay, is this a legal sale? What are the foreign policy implications? What are the human rights implications? What are the regional implications? And then once everyone has sort of said, yes, this makes sense, it goes up the chain until it gets to, the assistant secretary or the undersecretary of state to approve. That's the way it has always worked for every other context I've been a part of, other than in the context of Gaza and of Israel from 2023 onwards, where the process was flipped, where you actually had the Secretary of State, the Undersecretary of State coming in and saying, you will approve. There was no bottom-up process. There was no regional review. There was no policy review. It was simply that top-down direction to move forward.
Do you think that was a decision that Blinken himself made, or do you think that was a decision that Biden instructed Blinken to make?
No, I think that was, well, I think it was both. I think within the State Department, it was very clear that Tony Blinken was and continued to drive this. I think, though, that he was, on the same page as President Biden in thinking that, giving Israel that blank check was what America should do. And, was on the same page as President Biden in being unpersuadable, no matter how much harm, how much suffering, how much devastation was being caused as a result of that.
So let's pivot, right? Because it's been 2 years now. Obviously, Hamas is not defeated, despite claims by the Israeli government that they were going to do it. Uh, but at the same time, the hostages have been released. Uh, but we also saw many of them get killed during the war. We've also seen 60,000 Palestinians, uh, the official number, who have been killed. Uh, Most of them from the Gaza Strip have been displaced. We've seen acute scenes of malnourishment, of famine, uh, of what you would call a dire humanitarian crisis, uh, and an effect that is going to be felt years down the road. What is your diagnosis of the ceasefire deal that was put in place by the Trump administration?
Um, so, I mean, first of all, before talking about the ceasefire, I mean, look, you're absolutely right. The horrors that we have seen in Gaza and that we are complicit in as Americans, as American taxpayers, are unlike any I've certainly seen in our lifetime. And I think we have to recognize, yes, there are other genocides going on in Sudan, in Congo, but what we've seen in Gaza, first of all, when you look at the effect as a percentage of the population, far outstrips those, but also is one in which we are more directly complicit than any other, and I think therefore have a greater responsibility for. Um, when it comes to the ceasefire, so first of all, let's recognize that this is essentially a deal that was on the table for at least a year, possibly almost 2 years. As you said, the fact that the Biden administration in particular didn't push this ceasefire, didn't push Netanyahu to get to this point sooner, uh, is the cause not only of many of those, of tens of thousands of those deaths you referenced, but also would have saved the lives of the hostages, which was theoretically, Israel and America's objective. Um, I think at the same time, it is very clear that Netanyahu wants to squeeze as much out of this as he can for his own political interests. He is part of a government of Israel that, I think was brought kicking and screaming into this ceasefire and will do all it can to wriggle out of it. In fact, I mean, we call it a ceasefire, right? But we know that over 200 Palestinians have been killed, 100 of them in one night, over 100 in one night, during this so-called ceasefire. I think we also have to recognize that if we are going to use that term, a ceasefire, that is not the same as a peace, and that we are nowhere near a just and lasting peace. In fact, it's not even clear that there is anything remotely resembling a pathway to one. There is certainly, very little in this ceasefire agreement that there's no Palestinian role in designing it. There is very little Palestinian role, if any, in implementing it. And without the self-determination that is the Palestinian people's right, that is every people's right, you are not going to get to the political resolution that stops this from happening again and again. Uh, and yet at the same time, we see Israel continuing to try and push and to wriggle and to essentially re-baseline what a ceasefire is, so that a ceasefire isn't actually a cease of fire. A ceasefire is more like, you cease, we fire. And that is, I think something that the US and President Trump have to be very wary of, because it could not only undo all of these efforts, but I think it makes a mockery, frankly, of American leadership.
So you actually bring up there's 2 points I actually wanted to ask you that you mentioned. The first one is obviously, you know, having a just and lasting peace. And the second point is the role that Netanyahu plays in all of this. So as for those of you who are going to be watching, and as you know yourself know, Mr. Paul, the Palestinians and Israelis famously had a peace process that started with the Oslo Channel in the early 90s.
Yeah.
This kicked off the Oslo Accords. This kicked off a series of negotiations that ultimately led to the collapse of the peace process at the Camp David summit in 2000. And all attempts to try to revive it firmly came to an end in 2014 under Secretary of State John Kerry. And Netanyahu was prime minister during that time in the 90s, where many people, who have followed this have said that he was a huge impediment to the peace process. But on the flip side, you have many officials on the Israeli side and the American side who blame Yasser Arafat for uh, declining what they called a relatively good deal at Camp David. Now, there has been a lot of he said, she said about what happened at Camp David, on whether it was a good deal, whether it was a just deal. What are your thoughts on that narrative about what happened at Camp David?
Yeah, I mean, look, clearly I wasn't in the room at that point. I was, I think, still in college or on my way to grad school at that point. But having worked on the ground in the West Bank for the US security coordinator, um, and seen how sort of Oslo was implemented, this was, in 2008, 2009, and sort of the tail end, I guess you would say, of what had started as the Oslo process, I would say that there was an inbuilt problem from the get-go, and that is that Oslo was a peace process, but it was not a justice process. It essentially was a process that was established to bring security to Israel, but not justice for the Palestinians. And so from the very start, you had that problem set baked in there, and that really sort of materialized, for example, in the way that the Palestinian Authority was established ultimately, as a conditions-based process to get to uh, the actual right, which is self-determination. But you don't get to the state until you meet Israel's security requirements, which makes the Palestinian Authority not accountable to its own people for the delivery of, government services, representative government, all this sort of thing. But actually, its accountability ends up being to Israel for the delivery of security to Israel. And that fundamentally undermines its own ability to serve its own people. And I saw this firsthand working with the Palestinian police force, right? If you think of your average American police force, okay, plenty of problems, but you think of that slogan on the side of the car, and the goal is, right, to serve and protect. Um, who is the Palestinian Authority security forces serving and protecting for much of its existence? Well, it's hard to say it's the Palestinian people when the IDF are still coming in, grabbing people off the streets, conducting, all sorts of sort of operations into Palestinian cities. The audience for them, the people they're serving and protecting, ultimately ends up being Israel's security interests. And so you get to a point where the Palestinian Authority itself is lacking in legitimacy and credibility, uh, and at the same time, never being able to meet those, ephemeral security conditions that Israel sets and keeps shifting. And so I think the problem, the process from a start was flawed. And that's in great part why we are where we are today. And I think if we are going to restart a quote unquote peace process, it actually has to be a justice process. It has to be one that brings accountability, brings justice, brings equity, brings fairness, and doesn't end with a recognition of Palestinian rights, but starts with one.
So, you were talking about how with the way that the Oslo Accords were set up, how it put the Palestinians, some would say, as being a co-opter of the occupation in the West Bank. Obviously, right now we have a situation where the Palestinian leadership is split. You have Fatah under Mahmoud Abbas in the West Bank, and you have Hamas in the Gaza Strip. What agency, if any, do Palestinian leadership have in this? And from where you're sitting, what do the Palestinians need to do from a leadership perspective, in order to make their case? And it's not me saying it is just a question that obviously comes up all the time when people talk about the resumption of the peace process.
Yeah, I mean, I think first of all, it's not for me sitting here in America to tell the Palestinian people uh, what to do, how to run their affairs. In fact, I think, a lot of the problems we are in today is because America has taken on itself to determine the outcome and the direction and to assess, what elections should be recognized and what outcomes shouldn't be recognized. Uh, that said, I think it is obvious that there is a dearth of leadership in the current structures, and there is very clearly a need for new leadership. And my belief, is that the way to get to new leadership is through elections. But I think that's as far as I would go in terms of suggesting to the Palestinian people how they should go about their own affairs.
Now, on the flip side, on the Israeli side, obviously Benjamin Netanyahu has been in and out of power for the better part of almost 30 years now. It's 2025, 2026 is going to be almost 30 years since Netanyahu first got elected prime minister. Obviously, right now in Israel, you have the most right-wing government that has ever been in power in Israel. What needs to happen on the Israeli side? Because obviously, we have also been seeing, to a certain extent, a greater bend towards right-wing conservative politics, at least since the Second Intifada. So what needs to happen on the Israeli side for negotiations to be able to resume?
So I actually think an important part of the answer to that question is what needs to happen on the American side. And the reason I say that is that I think that Israel has been going off in this radically right-wing direction. In fact, you have people in government now who are self-described fascists in the form of Minister Smotrich, who's used that term to describe himself, because there has been impunity, because there has not been accountability, because there has not been any sort of consequences for Israel's actions, no matter how far they have gone in Gaza, in the West Bank, or in the region as a whole. Uh, and without that feedback mechanism, uh, Israeli politics and frankly Israeli society will continue to go in that direction. And the only place you're going to get that feedback mechanism is if the US removes the impunity shield that it has placed around Israel at the ICJ, at the ICC, at the UN, in terms of other third country efforts to impose consequences, to impose sanctions, to impose restrictions, whatever it might be. And so I think that if we want to see a change uh, in Israeli politics, we actually need to see that change in our own politics and policies. Because that's going to be, it's not going to come from within at this point. There's no feedback mechanism. There is no reason for there to be a change. We have to remove ourselves from that equation, or at the very least, radically shift our participation here so that that feedback mechanism can be felt, so that there are some consequences, and so that Israeli politics as a whole has to really think about where it is going and what it has done and where it goes from here. Without us changing, I just don't know that there will be a change there.
So that actually brings up another important question to ask because starting in the Clinton era, the policy of the United States has always been to criticize Israel privately, but embrace them publicly. Do you think that that strategy has failed?
Yes. Next question. I mean, it's very clearly failed, right? Because first of all, I'm not sure how much criticism there has actually been privately. There has certainly been a little, but by and large, it doesn't really matter what you say privately if your actual public actions, and when we say public actions, we don't just mean, of course, what we say publicly, but the provision of billions of dollars in military assistance is a public action. Vetoes at the United Nations are a public action. And those are where the consequences are. So it doesn't matter if pull Prime Minister Netanyahu aside behind closed doors and tell him, knock it off. If there is no actual consequence, which are the public consequences, then it's worse than nothing. You're actually just demeaning yourself in the process.
So basically what you're saying is that in order for Israel to be able to be in a position where they're going to where they can negotiate, what you're saying is that it has to happen in the US first. Change has to happen in the US in our policy towards Israel in order to ensure that they get into that position because they're not going to do it on their own.
I think certainly as it stands, where the US is very clearly Israel's guarantor, um, because of that role, unless we see a shift in how that role is carried out or an ending of that role, then I think that's right. We're not going to see that change in Israel because there's no incentive for that change to happen.
It's interesting that you mentioned that because after 2 years of this conflict, we have seen a complete change in public opinion regarding how Americans view Israel and Palestine. Before October 2023, most Americans favored the Israeli side. In fact, that has been a true line throughout Israel's existence as a country, where most people favor Israel. But now we have seen a shift, especially amongst younger people. Do you think that this trend will hold, especially with what you would call efforts by the Democratic and Republican establishment to reverse that trend, especially with things like the selling of TikTok to Larry Ellison, changes in how media is now covering this issue, along with efforts by the Trump administration to deport people who were protesting for Gaza on university campuses.
So I think that the public opinion has shifted and is not shifting back. And certainly that shift is most pronounced in the youngest generation. I think it's worth noting that it's not limited to the youngest generation, that across all demographics, across all politics, there has been a remarkable shift. It's strongest in the youngest generation, and I think America has shifted, period. The thing is, American politics, as you said, American political establishments haven't shifted. And I think, the top, and unfortunately, it's a fact that, public opinion doesn't always drive where American political decision making is, where, Congress is, where the White House is. And so I think it is now a task for all of us to make sure that that public opinion shift does actually translate into lasting, real political and ultimately policy changes. And that's, I mean, why Tariq Habash, who is another of the resignees from the Biden administration, and I co-founded the organization that I'm speaking to you from today, A New Policy, because we can see that, as millions now can, that what we are doing in the current US policy towards Israel and Palestine is fundamentally contrary to our own national interests. Is fundamentally contrary to anything that anyone, I think, on the political spectrum would espouse as American values. And yet the politics isn't shifting, the policies aren't shifting. And so what we need to do is to take the energy to the momentum, the real change that I think Americans across the country want, and make sure that our politicians are hearing that through lobbying, through advocacy, through energizing communities around the country, through electioneering. And that's what we're trying to do.
So I would say that because you also mentioned something about national interests. Obviously, the change in public opinion in the United States and the situation in the Middle East that we have seen has not happened in a vacuum.
Mhm.
We have seen countries around the globe that have routinely been against what has been going on in Gaza. We have seen traditional U.S. adversaries like Russia and China coming in and being against what has been going on. You yourself have said that this is against national interest, and we've also seen many people would say that international organizations, whether it is the UN or whether it is certain NGOs, have failed in their efforts to prevent outbreaks of of violence in this in like of this type. What is your take? What is your stance about where this leaves international multilateral institutions like the UN, and what are the future implications, not only to the US but also globally about our policy in the Middle East and what has been happening in Gaza?
Yeah, I mean, this is one of many reasons, right, why I think US policy towards Israel and Palestine and Gaza matters not only in terms of the immediate cost in human lives and Palestinian suffering, but in terms of its long-term implications. You know, the law is the law, and if we have such a thing as international law, then it applies to everyone. If it doesn't apply to everyone, if we can pick and choose who it applies to, then guess what? We don't have international law. We don't have an international rules-based order. We don't have, compliance. If compliance with the Geneva Conventions is no longer something that the US believes should be enforced globally, then it will not be enforced globally. And at some point, we are going to find ourselves very much in the crosshairs there as well. And so, what we are doing is significant harm to what Secretary Blinken himself would call the international rules-based order. In fact, I would argue probably lasting harm, right? Because we have demonstrated our own hypocrisy and implicitly through that, the hypocrisy of the system. And by doing that, we are not only creating the space for other countries and other bad actors to follow essentially in Israel's and our own footsteps and then turn around and say, well, why should I be held accountable when they're not being held accountable? But also essentially for the collapse of that system and for others to put forward alternatives that frankly will not be in anyone's interest because they will not have those standards of basic human rights and protection applied that should be applied, I think, on a global basis. So we are doing, I think, incredible harm and probably playing a role that I don't think we yet even recognize the magnitude of in the collapse of the post-World War II and certainly the post-Cold War order.
it's also, another point that you mentioned, right? Because, you know, as international institutions are beginning to weaken, we're also beginning to see more populist right-wing parties emerge all over the world, whether it's the MAGA movement here, whether it is the Hindu nationalist movement in India, or whether it is the strongman right-wing populists in Europe and South America. Do you think that the collapse of the international rules-based order is going to empower those kinds of movements?
Well, so I think first of all, those movements are also driving in part the collapse of that international rules-based order. And yes, the collapse of the rules-based order then in turn, I think, makes countries and turn inwards, as it were. But I also want to say that that there is a populist thread, certainly, that ties together, Netanyahu in Israel, that ties together, the Hindutva movement in India, white supremacy in America. But I think at the same time, there's been a miscalculation that those different movements are all inherently tied together and advanced together. In fact, not only have we seen increasingly a disconnect, interestingly, under President Trump with Prime Minister Modi in Israel, in India, but I think that Israel has been counting on that Republican populist movement to back it. And it's actually, I think, the Republican populist movement within the MAGA party, part of the Republican Party, that is moving away from Israel faster than the Republican establishment itself is. So, yes, I think that populism is a worrying trend on a global basis. But I don't know that we can necessarily make any assumptions about what that means for the US, Israel, or any other US, international relationship.
So where do you think China falls into all of this? Because obviously a key aspect of US foreign policy, especially since the Obama administration, has been the pivot to Asia, wanting to you know, lessen our involvement in the Middle East and put more focus on China. This is something that Obama famously said during his tenure in the White House. This is something that Trump also brought to the forefront through his tariffs on certain Chinese goods coming in 2018. And this was also a key aspect of the Biden administration foreign policy, especially as Jake Sullivan so famously put it, building a foreign policy for the middle class. But as you stated earlier, you're saying that our approach to Israel and Gaza has harmed the rules-based international order. Where does China fall into this mix? Is China going to be empowered? Would this increase the chances of China launching an attack on Taiwan? And if that were the case, because of our policy, would this weaken the US's ability to deter an attack on Taiwan?
So there's a lot to unpack in that, and let me start by saying I'm not a China expert. I do think that China does not want uh, a global order in which it is constrained or limited by the US, nor does it want to write its own global order, nor does it want chaos. I think it wants a system in which it can continue to grow, can continue to expand its own global network, its own regional influence, but do so in a way that is predictable, secure, prosperous. Um, and so I think that, at the same time that China is very clearly, and at the UN pointing to America's hypocrisy in its policies towards Israel, and the hypocrisy therefore of the underlying system. I don't think is keen for that system to completely fall apart. Um, so that's one piece of this. I think when it comes to the question of Taiwan, I mean, maybe what I'll say on that is more about the US's role here than China's, right? Which is that the US certainly up until this moment has made it policy that it would like to see continued peace in the Straits, but it also has been this talk of a pivot to Asia, a rebalance to Asia, that this is, where the centuries, greatest competition is. It's that Pacific competition and the Indo-Pacific. But the problem is that the US keeps getting pulled back into the Middle East. And in fact, I wouldn't only say pulled back into, but I think anchored there. If you look at how the US spends its global security assistance money, there's something called foreign military financing, which is the premier security assistance account for countries around the world. In your typical year, it's about $6.1 billion. Of that 6.1 billion, guess what? 3.3 billion goes to Israel, 1.3 billion goes to Egypt, 800 million or something in that order goes to Jordan, several hundred million more go to Tunisia and to Lebanon. And by the time you get through all that, there ain't that much left for the Indo-Pacific. And so I think that there is a real issue for America's ability to pivot, to rebalance, to refocus on what the new and emerging challenges are. At the same time, that we are continuing to let ourselves be anchored into a Middle East where Israel's problems continue to essentially define the security dynamic.
So it's one thing that you were mentioning earlier was, how during your time, the US was engaging in what you called a rational policy concerning Russia and Ukraine. As as you obviously know, Europe has also been heavily involved in the situation in the Middle East, and also has also been part of the US's broader strategic piece in the competition against China. Now, for those who are going to be watching this, many people don't know that Europe is actually Israel's largest trading partner, whereas the US provides Israel most of Israel's security. Where do you think that Europe falls into this mix?
Yeah, I mean, look, I think it's been evident for a long time that there is, you know, a gaping hole when it comes to European unity and when it comes to the role that Europe could be filling in the world, but is not. And that has been evident in the context of Ukraine. And I do think that as President Trump and this administration will continue to sort of make noises about, not wanting to be as engaged, not wanting to be as involved in that conflict, I think there is a clear demand signal for Europe to step up and to take more of a responsibility there. But that's also the case when it comes to Israel, right? Where the US has, again, uh, in fact, far worse, demonstrated a complete paucity of ability to lead, whether we are talking about policy leadership or moral leadership. But there, and there's a very clear vacuum there where someone needs to step up and grab the bull by the horns. And Europe would seem to be the logical partner to do that, given, as you point out, its trading relationship with Israel, given its history in the region, for better or worse, given its geographical proximity, and yet has broadly stayed silent, right? There have been some exceptions. I think Spain has been a very powerful voice for change, as has Ireland, as has Norway, as has increasingly Italy. And yet, Europe as a whole has missed the opportunity here and continues to do so. And so I think that you know that and it's a missed opportunity. I don't know what else there is to say about it. That it would be wonderful to see Europe step up more into these spaces that America is failing to fill or withdrawing from. But it just doesn't yet seem capable of doing so. I hope that we see that change.
So I had an opportunity not that long ago to speak with Aaron David Miller,
Mhm.
who was a former US negotiator under George H.W. Bush, Bill Clinton, and George W. Bush. And what Mr. Miller expressed to me was the role of the Arab countries and the role they play in the Israel-Palestine conflict, and how he was saying that the Arab countries have been unwilling, either unable or unwilling, to impose any kind of costs on their end on Israel. What is your take on his analysis? Do you think it's correct? Do you think it is unfair? Or do you think it is too simplified?
No, I think he's probably right. I think the one thing I would say differently is rather than Arab countries, I would say Arab regimes, because these are not democratic systems, I think if they were, we would see very, very different approaches in almost every Arab country when it comes to, Israel and Palestine. And that's, of course, one of the main reasons why they are not. And what we have created from the US is essentially a vicious cycle of the further Israel goes, the more we need to prop up the regimes and invest in their stability and their security, because the more pressure they begin to feel from their own people. Um, and so we create, instead of a virtuous cycle towards democracy, which I think, has at least been the hope of many in the American foreign policy field. What we end up doing in practice is actually a vicious cycle of repression and entrenchment. Uh, and I do think that's another reason, right, why shifting American politics and policies on Israel and seeing Israel itself shift as well is so key for the region. This whole question, for example, of the Abraham Accords is yet a further sort of doubling down in the hope that economic prosperity can somehow outweigh popular anger and political will. And that's just not going to be the long-term solution here. It's impractical and it's very fragile and very dangerous. I think that we need to see, not that Arab normalization with Israel is the key to unlocking things, but it's the Israeli-Palestinian conflict that is the key to unlocking normalization, not of the Arab countries with Israel, but of Arab governments with their own populations. That's the normalization that is more important here, and that will only come when we shift the US position on Israel.
So you speak about normalization. One of the lesser known diplomatic stories that happened in the Middle East right before October 2023 was the restoring of relations between Saudi Arabia and Iran. Now, now the Arab countries have had what you would call a famously historical contentious relationship with Iran.
Mhm.
This is some would call the rivalry with Iran one of the oldest geopolitical rivalries that goes back centuries when Persia was against the Byzantine Empire. But what we've also seen is a lot of these Arab countries becoming more wary of Israel rather than being wary of Iran. Where do you think Iran fits into this puzzle?
Um, I mean, first of all, look, you say more Arab countries become wary of Israel. I mean, Israel just bombed Qatar, right? And has, in the space of the last year, also bombed Lebanon, Syria, exchange of fire across the border into Egypt, boats off Tunisia, Yemen. I mean, there is not only a clear risk there, but there's also an assumption, I think, that a lot of the Arab countries, particularly the Gulf states, had baked in, which is that partnership with America means you don't have to look west. You can just look east when it comes to being concerned about the threat. That actually turns out maybe isn't accurate, or the strike on Doha suggests it's very clearly not accurate. And I think that forces a recalculation. At the same time, look, Iran does have interests across the region, is a significant regional power. That's not going to change, I think, regardless of what regime is actually in power in Iran. Right? I think that's a sort of baked in geopolitical thing that, sure, there could be shifts depending on changes within the government of Iran, but ultimately, that is a geopolitical dynamic that is pretty baked into the geography and the history. Um, but that there is at the same time very clear need for shared progress, that there's a very clear interest in a peaceful path forward. um I think part of the question here has to do with uh, Israel's own utilization of Iran as the boogeyman to, explain why it needs this, it's under this constant threat and it has this constant fear, all that sort of thing. At the same time, I think the Iranian regime also has that utilization of Israel as the boogeyman for its own purposes, to contain its own population and to extend its own regime. So, it's a difficult knot to untangle. I think the Saudi normalization or progress there was really important as a step along the way. And, I think we'll continue to see steps along that way. But I also think we will continue to see Israel trying to throw a wrench in there because it doesn't want to see ultimately a region that is entirely complacent and at peace with itself and accepting of Iran as a part of that region.
So, you're talking about Israel the is like Israel's relationship with Iran. Israel itself has also seen a massive drop in public support. Uh where does Israel's future lie in all of this? Because Israel, in terms of, its own stated policy, has always been of military deterrence, where anytime they get hit, they're going to hit back with three times the power to discourage further attacks. But we have seen throughout that history that deterrence, while it may stave off attacks for a short time, in the long term, those attacks are going to continue to happen.
Right.
So, in your perspective, what does Israel need to do in order for like, along with dealing with the Palestinian issue, what other things does Israel need to change in order for them to be able to tend after their national security concerns?
Yeah, I mean, it's not, you're absolutely right, right? That the Israeli national security doctrine is essentially premised on the idea that we're never going to be entirely secure, we're never going to be entirely at peace. Therefore, it's deterrence, and when deterrence fails, it's, exponential violence, and then you're back into that deterrence cycle. And that's really, not a strategy that is going to be viable over the very long term. Um, so I don't have a good question to this. I don't know how Israel breaks out of this cycle again, other than having to make a rational set of considerations and decisions that are not shielded, that are not, where it has to face again the consequences of its own actions, where this impunity is lifted, where there is accountability. Because I think that again, until you get to the point where those are the sorts of decisions and the context that Israel has to start considering its position in the region and in the world in, uh, it's not going to find that peace or security. It's going to maybe continue to push the ball down the road and by itself 5 years at a time at the cost of however many tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands of Palestinian lives. But it is not going to find itself actual security. The only way to do that is through pursuing, uh, first of all, is through being realistic and connecting with the reality, uh, and then pursuing, something approaching justice. And that, again, I think is dependent on us here in the United States to set that path, because we're not going to even start approaching that path until we make it.
Two final questions. Where can people find your work? And what are three books that you recommend?
Ooh. So where can people find my work or our work? It's anewpolicy.org. That's ANEWPOLICY.org. And do visit the website. Please do sign up for our newsletter, visit our legislative tracker, see what's going on in Congress and all the work we're doing. Three books. So the first one, there's something called the Atlas of the Conflict, which I think was first published in 2001 or so. And I actually have it just sitting on my bookshelf over there, just out of sight for me to actually be able to read who wrote it. But it is an incredible collection of maps with demographic overlays, historical overlays, economic overlays of Israel and Palestine, that goes essentially from prehistory to the current day. So that's an incredible resource. Second one, I actually do happen to have sitting with me right here, is actually a publication that was just put out by the Arab Center of Washington, D.C., called U.S. Pivot from Middle East, Fact or Fiction. It's a collection of essays by experts looking at exactly what we've just been discussing. When the US says it is moving away from the Middle East, which is rebalancing to Asia, is it actually doing that? What are the signs it's doing that? Is it going to succeed? Why isn't it going to succeed? So I would definitely recommend that one as well to your audience.
Josh Paul, thank you for joining us.
Great. Thank you very much for having me.